think it's time to start the session. My name is Lena Reimann, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the co-conveners of the session who designed the session together with me, which are colleagues from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, short Vrije Amsterdam. Okay, there we are. And also William Solecki from Hunter College at CUNY here in New York. So yeah, the reason why we designed this session, or why we proposed this session, was that yeah, we basically need migration modeling as a basis to more inform coastal decision making. So somehow we need to find a way to designate maybe areas where different adaptation strategies are most suitable, and this all needs to be somehow based on modeling. And so the last couple of days we've not really been talking about migration modeling or also adaptation modeling a lot, so I think this is a nice way to also finish this conference. And I think this is something we talked about a lot, are these three different adaptation strategies, which are we going to protect, are we going to accommodate, or are we going to retreat, or which areas are actually going to be affected. And this is on the one hand side, an autonomous kind of decision, which happens on the individual or on the household level, but it can also be a planned decision on the policy level. And this is basically what we want to do in this session, is to improve existing adaptation and migration modeling efforts by addressing these 3 points, which are taking stock of current state-of-the-art data and methods in simulating human adaptation and migration behavior in response to sea level rise at different spatial scales, so from the local up to the global scale. And I think this is a nice basis for discussion, actually, how to integrate these different spatial scales as well. And of course, there are very different requirements also to modeling approaches that model on the local versus the global scale. And then we also want to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of these methods. And in the third step, also reflect on how to couple existing social and physical science approaches in future research. So I'm really curious about the discussions that we're going to have, how to model migration, what the different perspectives are. And in order to address these aims or reach these aims, the session is structured as follows. So we first, I'm giving this introduction right now, and I told you the session name, so that's done. And then we will have 10-minute talks, so quite short talks. We start with data, so hopefully we start with data, because so far I think Yoonjung Ahn, she was not there yet, so because she's presenting online, she's there, so perfect, she can start off. And then followed by Sam Doundam and Andrew Bell. And I think there's a switch, right? I think I said that Andrew Bell was second and then Sam, so sorry about that. So that's a mix up here. And then we continue to different modeling approaches, looking at the local scale in Bangladesh by Roland Smith, and then the global scale by Lars Tierolf. And if everything goes well, we will have a good 30 minutes for question and answers, for a discussion about the topics that we talked about. Yeah, thanks very much. And let's start with Yoonjung. There's now, I think, a mix up in the. She's sharing her screen. Okay. Yoonjung, can you hear us? And are you there?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I will share the screen.
Yeah, maybe we can also, it would be nice to see you as well. So give me one. How, like this? Okay, at least we can see your pic. Ah, yeah, there you are. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, feel free to start.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me in this session. I'm Yoonjung Ahn. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm very excited to share our research, which is focusing on implications of global and local data for understanding populations at risk of seaward hazard and adaptation planning. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge all my co-authors who put great effort in this analysis and research. I actually prepare a little longer presentation, so I might have to skip some description for each slide, and I will answer those parts if you are wondering via email or after this session. So our research was motivated to understand the disproportion of seaward hazards. As many of the literature discussed before, vulnerability is determined by several factors such as environment and socio-demographic conditions. So some areas, such as lower elevation coastal zones, are more vulnerable to seaward hazards than others. So to reduce this impact, evaluating trends of population exposure and identifying the determinants of these vulnerable locations are necessary, because this will help determine adaptation or mitigation of the responses to safeguard these locations and people who are at risk. So in this analysis, we conducted to fill in some of the gaps in the existing literature by understanding the spatial and temporal variation of population exposure, and also understand the constraints that are caused by spatial structure and estimation method that the global population products that develop their estimation. And also we used some finest scale of census data for the US as a reference data to understand the implications and limitations of using different spatially aggregated data and in different time points. So in this analysis, we used census data, the number of population data at census block level as a reference data. And we also used 4 different global population data sets that developed based on different assumption and estimation method. For example, GHS-POP was developed based on relocating population to built-up area, and GPW was developed based on proportional allocation without ancillary variables, and also constrain the growth rate at medium resolution input, such as national level or sub-national level. And we also used World Pop Global dataset, which was used from top-down or bottom-up method, and then scan data, which was developed based on US census data with fine spatial scale ancillary variables. We also used lower elevation coastal zone data, which was developed based on Merit digital elevation map. And we also incorporated historical settlement data compilation of the US. We already published this first version of the data set, which was 250-meter gridded cell level of built-up area information. And we are making a second version, which has better completion and coverage of the spatial, especially have a better completion and coverage. And we use that newer version in this analysis. So we focused on 364 counties in the US, which have any land areas in LECZ, which was measured up to 10-meter elevation. We also used block level census data as a reference data to compare with global population product to examine population count and growth rate in different time points. We also used HISTEC data to research and understand why this global data product may different from census population data. So this is the summary of the population count in and out of LECZ in 2020. As you can see from the table, the top 2 tables describe the population count, and the bottom 2 tables show the population proportion. And as you can see from the table, top 2 tables, the global product tended to underestimate the population inside of LECZ. However, it overestimates the outside of LECZ. So there are 7 or 8 million more population in LECZ from census than other global product estimation. We also compare the growth rate from 1990 to 2020. 4 of the global data set we were using, only two of them were available for 1990 population data set. So we only presented two population data set here. And we found that census placed 25 million people in 1990 in the LECZ, which was more than 5 million from either GPW or GHS-POP. And as you can see from the table, they are agree on the growth rate, both from census data and global products. However, the percentage of growth was differ by 3 or 4%. And we wanted to go one step further to investigate what is really going on. And so we divided this LECZ inside and outside into 6 categories. As you can see from the figure, we divided with the red colors and blue color. And the red color represents the population growth inside of LECZ, while the outside of LECZ population either grow or decline. And the blue color represents the opposite. And we found that 19 counties have land areas only in LECZ. So the darkest red color and the darkest blue color represent this area that only have population inside of LECZ. And we found that 70% of places, like counties, that experience population growth both in and outside of LECZ. And we compare this growth rate with census data and GPW and GHS-POP. The numbers inside of the parentheses represent the negative growth. So as you can see from the table, GHS-POP does not detect the negative growth rate for the most part. And even GPW does not does not detect the outside of LECZ. We also examine the first year build of LECZ with HISTEC data. As you can see from the figure, historically people desire to live in near the coastline. So inside of LECZ tend to have older buildings, and some areas also have some newer buildings than outside of LECZ. But the peak year of the built buildings outside of LECZ was a few years older than inside of LECZ. We also divided this first year built data set according to the 6 categories we developed based on the population data set. And as you can see from the figure, the year built is more recent in the counties that have experienced population increase in LECZ. We also mapped out this information of the LECZ categories we developed and also the first year built information. And as you can see from the figure, where the population declines, the blue colors have tended to have older buildings than the population growth in LECZ. However, there are a few counties that disagree on this. If you can see the blue squared area, even if it says that there is population decline, which represents the blue color, but it tended to have red color for the which represents the newer buildings in the LECZ. So we need to investigate further on this to understand what is really going on in this area. So in this research, we used global data products and found that it may misestimate the population exposure in LECZ. And we also found that some of the products underestimate the exposure. However, it also depends on how these products are developed. For example, unlocated data, GPW, tended to underestimate the population. However, the population relocated to build up area, which was GHS pop, tended to overestimate the growth in LECZ. We also found that HISTAC US reveals some of the buildings are like newer or older than outside of LECZ, but HISTAC data does not account for rebuilds or demolished buildings. So this is something we need to investigate further on this, as well as GHS pop data. They also have the assumption that once built is always built. So place population where there's buildings no longer exist. So we will use some of the data products such as parcel data or HISTAC version 2, which contains vacant land area to understand this further. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any question, please feel free to reach out to Deborah or myself, and I'm happy to take any questions and comment if I have some time left. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yoonjung. I think we are going to first go through all the presentations and then do the Q&A afterwards. So if you could stick around until then, this would be perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next one is Andrew.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. All right, I'm very happy to be here and talk about my research together with colleagues Wouter, Botzen, Jeroen, Aerts, which are in the room today as well, and Lieslot Hagedorn. And I will talk about my survey research on the drivers of migration and adaptation behavior under increased flood risk from sea level rise. So my research is part of the COSMOVE project, which is a 5-year research project led by Professor Jeroen Aerts. And the aim of our project is to understand and model migration and adaptation behavior of coastal residents under sea level rise, in which an agent-based model is developed, about which Lars will talk about later. But we also apply surveys and experiments to understand human behavior, so we can also improve our modeling efforts there. We've written a review paper about what has already been done on drivers of migration behavior under sea level rise. And what we found here, first of all, we use this framework where we acknowledge that sea level rise is just one of these many factors that influence migration. So besides these factors, there are also political, economic, social, household level factors that all influence if a person makes this decision or not. And what we found is that at present, studies find mixed effects for the effects of flooding on migration. So some find that it does increase migration, others that it does not increase migration. For erosion and salinization, there are only very few studies done, and they generally find a positive link with migration. But of course, as I said before, other factors also play a role. So there is, for example, wealth that influences migration. So more wealthy individuals are more likely to actually migrate under sea level rise risk, and also social networks and of course place attachment play a role in this. However, from the studies so far, it's quite hard to make comparisons. First of all, because studies, survey studies, and census data studies use different methodologies. So some look at migration intentions, others look at actual migration, some look at the impact just after a flood event, others maybe in a year or more after the flood event. So all these kind of things influence, and that's also what we discuss in this paper, how it might influence migration. For example, just after a flood, people might have a reduction in financial resources, which may not make them able to migrate. But maybe they anticipate migration in the future. They're like, okay, now I don't have the resources to migrate, but in 1 or 2 years I plan to migrate because I don't want to experience this again. And second of all, the focus is on past flood events, while in the future, when flooding will be more intense and will occur more frequently, migration patterns may differ. So to contribute to these research gaps that are there, in terms of looking at only past flood events, we conducted a study, a survey study in Vietnam with 400 respondents. And there we also not only looked at their current migration intentions, but also posed them future flood scenarios where flooding will increase. So in 2020, there was a major flood in central Vietnam, and we carefully constructed this scenario where such flooding would occur twice or even 5 times more often, and see how would that influence their migration. So in this figure, right at the bottom, you can see that now more than 90% of people say, okay, I'm definitely not going to migrate in the coming 5 years. But under the 5 times more flood scenario, this is only 60%. On the other hand, 60% of people still are certain to stay when extreme flooding will occur 5 times more frequently. And second of all, we also looked at a wide plethora of other variables that influence migration, and we found that people who already adapted their homes to flooding are less likely to migrate. People who have strong social networks outside their place of residence are more likely to migrate, and the other way around for when there's strong community bonding. And we find that past experience during flood, like evacuation, are very important in pushing people to actually wanting to migrate. So we published that study recently in Climatic Change. But the big project of my PhD was to do, and together with Lisa Hagedorn actually, to conduct surveys in 4 countries in different areas in the world. So in the United States, in New York, Florida, in Mozambique, Argentina, and in France. And we did around 800 to 1100 household surveys in those areas, where we of course incorporated, besides all these sea level rise related and flood related questions, a bunch of other things that are important or hypothesized to be important in migration decisions. And in the coming slides, I will present some preliminary findings of these surveys, while I focus on the results in the US. So just for the 4 countries, I only showed this slide, also because I have not that much time. And what it shows is migration intentions under different flood scenarios that we posed to respondents. So we had 4 flood scenarios. The first was the current scenario, how likely or to what extent do you intend to migrate in the coming 5 years. But we also asked it on the scenarios where flooding would occur every 10 years, or major flooding would occur every 10 years, every 5 years, or every year. And I have 2 things to point out here. So first of all, what we see is that migration intentions are much higher in developed countries than in developing countries. So a reason for that could be that people have more resources to migrate in developed countries, but also because maybe we have less of a sense of place in developed countries than in developing countries, where people often rely on their livelihoods in their specific location. And second of all, we see that always under increased flood risk, migration intentions also do increase. So people do foresee that it could influence their behavior. And now I will focus on the results in New York and Florida. So we did all the surveys, by the way, in 2022, also in the other countries, 437 surveys in New York and 623 in Florida, in zip codes overlapping with the coastal zone. So all these black dots that you see on the map, on the left in New York and on the right in Florida, are these areas that we've targeted. And data shows that flooding is really important there. 30% of people experience flooding in the past 10 years, and a large majority of the people believes that sea level rise will or already is a problem in at least the coming 20 to 30 years. So I'm just going to show you some descriptive statistics now. So in terms of in situ adaptation in these areas, we see that a majority of people in New York actually adapted, or of this sample, adapted to flooding, they adapted their homes to flooding. And in Florida, there's a little bit less. And if we ask people that have not implemented measures yet, if they plan to do so in the future, we actually see that the majority is not planning to do that in the future. So there is this group of people that has not implemented and does not plan to implement flood adaptation. And if we look at migration, we see that in New York, migration intentions are a bit higher. So a larger share of people says that it's likely or certain that it will migrate in the near future or under these scenarios, a bit less in Florida. And we see that, flooding has quite a big influence. So for example, when people in New York would say that it will migrate for certain, that's only 15% in the current situation, and it rises to more than 30% under this worst case scenario where a major flood would occur in their neighborhood every year. What is often important in people's migration decision is if they actually feel capable to migrate. Maybe they would want to migrate, they have aspirations to migrate, but maybe they don't feel capable. And actually what we see is there's quite some people, both in Florida and New York, and just don't feel capable to migrate. So around 10% says that they're not at all capable, and almost 20% in both areas say they are only slightly able. So that's quite interesting as well. And finally, what I'm showing here is we talk, of course, a lot about management retreat here. And if we ask people, okay, to what extent do you prefer a management retreat policy, we actually see mixed findings. So there are quite some people who say, hey, that would actually be, I have strong or very strong preferences for this. But also, especially in Florida, there we see that 20% say, okay, hell no, I don't want this managed retreat to happen in the neighborhood where I live in. So I'm now showing you a preliminary regression, which I just quickly made just to show you some indications about what influences these migration intentions. Thanks. In New York and Florida. So there are some things that we see that are both of influence in Florida and New York. So we see that capability to migrate is a very, maybe I should explain this graph. So we see so we have 4 pluses or minuses, and that show the different scenarios. So the first one is the current scenario all the way up to this worst case flood scenario. And we see that in all cases, capability to migrate, so self-efficacy, is a very strong determinant of migration. We also see that place attachment is important, both in Florida and New York. And to a lesser extent, we also see that risk perceptions, external social networks, so if they know people that live in other places where they could potentially migrate to, are important. But we also see some differences. So for example, we see that worry is important in the case of Florida, but in New York, for example, not. But in Florida, we also see that migration experience, so if people have migrated before, is important determinant or significantly associated with higher migration intentions. And what's interesting is that we do see here at least a limited influence of in situ adaptation. So people who adapted their homes to flooding are not necessarily less likely to move, even though it reduces their flood risk. And also people who have experienced flooding are not necessarily more likely to migrate. So to finish this off, this is all very preliminary, right? I just thrown a bunch of early statistics at you, but this is actually quite interesting, first of all, for anticipatory policy making to better understand, okay, how can we expect migration to change under flood risk? How could that actually, what could it actually look like? Because as of now, we don't really see research that looks at future flood scenarios. Well, we do want to know about how migration behavior might change under these scenarios. Second of all, we see that migration intentions increase, but there are also a large bunch of people that do not intend at all to migrate, even under the worst case flood scenarios. So for these kind of people, extra government support might be needed to make sure that they can still live in place or that they do have the capability to migrate, for example. And in my research, the next step is now to do this formal analysis of the 4 countries and see how these drivers differ across contexts and across people. So that was it. I just provide some contact information below and some further references regarding our project. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ronan Smith. I'm a Leverhulme Doctoral Scholar at the University of East Anglia and the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. I'm, again, very similar to Sem, giving an overview of a project which is quite early in its stages, and part of the reason I wanted to present it here today was actually enter into dialogue and get responses from colleagues, sorry, I'm just going to set the timer so I don't run long, about the structure and the approach of the study. So, you know, you can all sit there and actually look at what I'm presenting and put it in the context of what Andrew said at the start of the session to kind of see how that thinking kind of carries through and how that works as a critique. So given 10 minutes, I'm going to be looking quite top level. So I'm going to introduce you and give an overview of the study, particularly the framework of the study itself, looking at the empirical data I'm using and the conceptual model that I've developed to formulate the approach, and then a little bit about the structure of the agent-based model, partly around the motivation for using that approach and also the decision-making theory. And those of you in the room who've used agent-based models understand the decision-making theory is kind of key for how that's formulated. And then just outline some of the next steps. So I think in the public imagination, and to a certain degree, studies looking at sea level rise and mobility have tended to focus on inundation, i.e. so we're kind of focused on land which is being lost to the sea. And you know, that can be defined in many ways, but take Robert Nichols' example. You take a projection of sea level rise that suggests a land area will lie within a 1 in 1 year floodplain level. So you're expecting inundation annually. The resulting impact on buildings and infrastructure will render that uninhabitable, and the populations living there will be displaced. So you're taking a map of where people live, you're taking a projection of sea level rise, you're putting one over the other, and you say at a certain point those would be displaced. Incredibly useful, incredibly complex, and really informs a lot of our approaches to this. But obviously there's certain things that it overlooks. The first thing is, well, how will that mobility manifest itself? If you've got a 100-year projection of this land will be inundated, and we take from now, at what year are you going to see those mobility flows? Is it year 99? Is it year 50? Or is it year 105 because people will try to remain in place, as many studies have shown that people attempt to do and attempt to do with some success? The other side is that the way that people will experience sea level rise, people, households, will be through a series of complex, cumulative and compounding environmental shocks and stresses. So we're looking specifically at Bangladesh here, so I'm taking it from the literature around that subject. So increase in storm surge, flavio-tidal flood, soil salinity, which impacts on livelihoods through loss of agricultural land and also affects, I'm going to try and say it, habitability through lack of freshwater access, as well as river erosion. And those of you who were in Jan's talk a couple of days ago will have heard in great detail about those. So the question is then, how will those environmental shocks and stresses interact with existing drivers of migration? And this is an issue that I think has come up a lot over the last few days, and I think we're all aware of, but it's always worth highlighting. We are not looking at a static system. These environmental shocks and stresses are integrated with those existing drivers of mobility, and we're going to see that next. Is there a potential for that cumulative impact to trigger thresholds and sociological thresholds? Are we likely to see those non-linear shifts in magnitude or direction of mobility as a result of these pre-inundation effects? You can see existing literature on the impact of soil salinity, which has a greater relationship with changes in migration flows than flooding alone. And finally, are these changes in migration, if they occur, are they going to be well in advance of the timescales, where if we're looking at inundation alone? So this is sort of what's driving the research approach. I'm going to use, hoping to use an agent-based model to simulate those effects. I'm utilizing pre-existing data. So this is an interesting process because I wasn't involved in developing this approach, but it's the DECMA project, which some of you may be aware of, Delta's Vulnerability in Climate Change, Migration and Adaptation. So this is a household survey which took place over 4 locations, 4 Delta locations, 2 of those in India, so about 5,500 households. I'm taking the data from coastal Bangladesh, and you can see here the map split by division. And this is interesting. I could go into more detail about this with more time, but each one of these regions tends to experience the impact of sea level rise or environmental shocks analogous to sea level rise in a different way. From the left corner, where they're more susceptible to salinity, to the eastern, where it's more susceptible to storm surge generally. And that data will, number one, try to understand what the existing migration flows are. Again, this is a dynamic system. We're not talking about static populations, as is the case with many vulnerable and exposed populations around the world. And then try to understand the historic influence of environmental shocks and stresses. What has been the impact of those shocks and stresses on mobility decision making? So this has led to the development of the conceptual model. You can see there's almost like a thread that you can see with all our conceptual models leading back to foresight. But here you have the way that I conceptualize it. You have sea level rise, but that is manifested through a series of pre-inundation shocks and stresses. Those are experienced by a series of impacts. And you could categorize these in many ways, but this is actually drawn from, influenced by the survey itself, from what was asked about it. The, impact on homes and infrastructure, your economic security, crop disease, livestock disease. But of course, this is feeding into the existing dynamic system where there are already macro drivers on migration, the pushes and pulls. For example, the rise of the garment industry and the draw of livelihoods away from rural communities towards urban centres. You have your meso influences, the impact, for example, on remittances of previous migrants. Is that influencing people's ability to adapt? Is it influencing their ability to migrate? And of course, then the individual household's capabilities and your aspirations. And in the middle, there's a red circle, which kind of should be a black box, if you see what I mean. So that's where the decision-making process takes place. And then I have characterized this with 3 outcomes: households adapting in situ, migrating, or this idea that they have an aspiration to migrate but don't have the capabilities to do so. So describing that as immobile or trapped. And crucially, as soon as that decision is made, it's then feeding back into subsequent decisions. So again, we have to characterize this as a dynamic system. So the role of using an agent-based model, the motivation is that I want to simulate this multifaceted migration decision-making process. Because what we are trying to do, and I think others have alluded to this, is we're taking physical environmental systems, which are modeled, and then trying to link these with human decision-making processes. So by using an agent-based model, you're able to center on the agents, on its behavior, rather than trying to model it at an aggregate level. And crucially, because I think we'll understand, I can talk about this more and others will know this, crucially, it's about those network effects. What is the impact of other people moving? What is the impact of those cumulative and complex related environmental shocks and stresses? So what is the role of the ABM? And I think Sam touched on this slightly. It's in this case, I'm using it less as a forecast model, but more about a way of trying to identify the relationships between these components. It's really interesting. I think when you modelers themselves, you ask, we are very aware of the limitations and the assumptions of the work we're doing. And as my supervisor, Robert Nichols, would say, that a model is simply a good way of starting a conversation. So I think we can always approach these studies with a certain amount of humility about what the aspirations for the work actually are. Within constructing the ABM, conceptually, the decision-making process, that's how each agent, which represents a household, is characterized within the agent-based model. I'm drawing on that lineage which goes back to Dom Knifton around basing it on the theory of planned behavior, which is a social psychological theory about how people arrive at decisions. So in the survey itself, it asks households, do you have migration intention? Does someone in your household have the intention to migrate in the near future? So the theory of planned behavior says that our decision-making process is combined of three elements. I always think of it in me trying to give up smoking. You have the attitude towards that behavior, you know, whatever you feel about that. There's a subjective norm, which is how society judges and influences that behavior, and then perceived behavioral control. Do you have the ability to carry that out? So in translating that into the model, we're able to use the empirical data from the survey to try and weight, coming to the end, try and weight those elements of the decision-making process. For example, the individual behavioral attitude, and we're looking at household agents, size of households, history of migration, age, sex, and specifically location. And the survey itself will ask about their attitudes to migration. The subjective norm is where we try and capture the network effect. So what is the influence of families and friends, as well as their visual changes, their understanding and perception of the changing environment. And then finally, the perceived behavioral control, which is a potential for them to actually undertake migration action. So you're looking at resource availability, livelihood stress, and capabilities. So effectively, what we're trying to do is then take that decision-making process and model it using that the empirical data from the survey, into using the theory of planned behavior to kind of give us this weighted decision-making model, which hopefully is drawing and sort of assumes the influences of the macro, micro, and meso effects. And then you have the decision-making process that will come out of the model, including destination selection. Again, that's weighted, drawing on the survey data that we're using on, which will then give an indication also of the forms of migration undertaken. And of course, underneath this, we will be able to parameterize it with census data going back over the last 4 sessions. So that's the kind of overview of the approach and how we're kind of approaching and trying to get around this, linking the empirical or projections of the impacts of sea level rise, but also trying to integrate and develop a model which reflects the decision-making process. And the next steps for then are then to supplement this work with further field work, hopefully working with migrant communities in local urban centres to understand their perceptions of their past decision-making. And then we can start to develop the model itself. And I'll be able to present some findings for you. Many thanks.
Yeah. So hello everyone, my name is Lars Tierolf, and I will present to you some of our work on the COASTmove project, in which we are building a global agent-based model of adaptation and migration decisions in the face of sea level rise. So I'm part of a larger project group. We already saw the presentation of Sam on the survey data. And my task is to set up this agent-based model to France and incorporate an erosion model which should then be upscaled as well to the global scale. Global sea levels are rising, which increases flood hazard for exposed coastal populations. So for example, we will see flooding as this one in Long Island more frequently and more severely in the coming decades. So communities who are experiencing these changes in their environment, we can distinguish broadly between 3 types of responses. So for example, they may not respond at all, meaning they will experience more flooding and more damage. They may accommodate these changes, so this increasing flood hazard, for example, by installing dry flood-proofing measures, such as watertight doors or compartments or elevating homes. Or they might retreat or migrate, meaning they will move out of the hazardous area and locate either to an inland area, or they might still end up in another hazardous area. But each of these decisions is influenced by individual characteristics, such as risk perceptions, meaning whether households actually perceive if they are in an area of hazard or risk. But also wealth, income can determine whether people are able to invest in these accommodating measures. But also place attachment, age, education all play a role in shaping what households will do when they are experiencing these changes in coastal flood hazards. And currently, these larger scale assessments of coastal exposure to increasing flood risk generally do not really account for these individual characteristics and mostly assume people are inundated, so they will move. So in this study, we try to better understand this behavior and also better model this behavior in response to coastal flood risk. by building an agent-based model which simulates household adaptation and migration decisions in the coastal floodplain, together with a gravity model which still simulates coastward migration, which is still expected to continue into the future. So to this end, we create an agent population of households residing in the 1 in 100-year floodplain. And we create this agent population using gridded population data and also update characteristics such as income and wealth based on the socioeconomic, shared socioeconomic pathways, and which we also account for natural population growth to occur in these regions. And then we also incorporate 2 types of coastal hazards at this moment. So we account for coastal flooding and coastal erosion hazard under different climate change scenarios. And then we simulate the household behavior, which could be this no action, this accommodating of these changes for implementing adaptation measures, or the migration response, which means that people will move away. And we do this in a framework of subjective expected utility, in which we account for this dynamic risk perception, for which we know that people who have never experienced a flood tend to think that they are not in a hazardous location, but after just having experienced the flood, they tend to overestimate risk. But we also account for other characteristics such as wealth, income, but also coastal amenities and place attachment that might inhibit people from moving away. So the goal of this modeling exercise, of course, is to model and better understand this local decision-making under sea level rise and future development as in the shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios. So now I will walk you through some of the modeling schedule. So for each time step, we first update the population residing in the floodplain using the shared socioeconomic pathways, which account for the natural population growth and decline. And then we update the coastal flood hazard under a specific climate change scenario. And we also account for beach erosion under this climate scenario, and then simulate a flood event. And these stochastic flood events determine the risk perception of the households that might be affected by this flood event. And we also account for government action. So government can either choose to increase their flood protection standards, so for example, elevate dikes, or they can also renourish beaches, which again also counteracts this erosion under sea level rise. And then we do the household decisions based on this subjective expected utility, in which household again decide to either do nothing because they might not be able to floodproof their homes, or to migrate to another inland area or another coastal area. And the model then processes these decisions by the households. So I will now walk you through a single model run, just to show you some of the model dynamics in Pas-de-Calais in France. So we start up with an agent population in which some households have already implemented dry floodproofing measures, and others have not yet implemented these measures. And we derive this percentage of households that have implemented measures based on survey data in France. And when we then run the model, we see that after random flood events that are shown here with the return period in the dashed lines, we see a small dip in population, meaning that in this model run, the population migrates, or at least a part of the population migrates after having experienced a flood event. But we see a larger response when looking at households that have implemented dry floodproofing measures. So again, this dynamic risk perception of people not experiencing risk, having never perceived a flood, and then perceiving a flood determines whether or not people will invest in these dry floodproofing measures. This also has some effect on residential flood risk. With people implementing dry floodproofing measures, their risk is lower. And also with people moving away, their risk will be lower because less people are affected by the flooding, resulting in this sort of jigsaw pattern of the evolution of risk over time. So when looking at the flood risk in all of France for 50 model runs, and this is a combined scenario of a worst case climate change scenario with shared socioeconomic pathway scenario 5, we see that when accounting for coastal adaptation, the flood risk will be a lot lower than when not accounting for coastal adaptation. But we also see that when not accounting for sea level rise, we still see a significant increase in coastal flood risk due to this continued coastward migration driven by coastal amenities and population growth in these areas. So when looking at the population, we see a smaller response, but there is a response as well. So when accounting for adaptation, we see that more people will live in the coastal floodplain, meaning that less people will have decided to move away. And the same applies when not accounting for sea level rise. There's also an effect of adaptation on the population development, because also now there are coastal hazards that play a role in shaping these decisions. So the model also produces these kinds of spatially, we can distinguish spatially where most adaptation and migration will take place, allowing us to also identify areas where that might be hotspots of migration into the future, but also areas where less households will be able or willing to adapt to flood risk by implementing these adaptation measures. So just to provide an outlook of further development, we will upscale this modeling approach to the global scale, where we also apply the survey data as just presented by Sam, for example, to calibrate and validate the decision rules of the households in these floodplains. And we also will work on, next to coastal flooding and coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion as well, since especially in delta areas, this may also influence people's ability to make a living there from agriculture. And ultimately, we aim to also assess different governmental and insurer policies in these model runs by defining the conditions of the behavior of the agents and governments. So that was my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much for all of these nice presentations. I think that gave a lot of potential for discussion. So I would like to invite everyone who's presented to come to the front and sit here in the panel, and then we open for question and answers, for discussion, for whatever comes to mind. And then, of course, also, let's not forget that we have Yoonjung online, so let's have her
We
here
have
as
a
well.
question from one of the virtual participants, if we could start with that. Yeah. So this question is from J.L. Onderpont. They have not supplied their institutional affiliation. The question is for Yoonjung. There are multiple reports of the political impact of the Trump administration on how the 2020 census data was collected and assessed. Was this impact on the 2020 census data taken into account with these results?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for sharing the concern. We, at this stage, we are doing a proof of concept for this presentation, but that's something that we would like to consider in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions. Number one, when you, I'm assuming that when you use Kahneman's and Tversky, your behavioral economics, and how do you input political ideology and political behavior when people make decisions, especially when voting, for people who support environmental sustainability or non-environmental sustainability, especially in taxation, because some people who support environmental sustainability might not really want to pay for it, because of that perspective. So how do you factor that? And the second thing is, a few months ago I was at a conference, and Meta, Facebook, they have what they call data for good, and they use data to understand situations in India and Africa, how it impacts people in migration and stuff. Have you used that source as a way of understanding issues? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. I haven't used that source, but now I've got something to do over lunch and dig into that. But with this challenge of like ideologies or other things that aren't directly observable, it's a bit of a challenge when we design experiments, in large part then because it's harder to design upfront who should be in your sample. I think there are techniques you can apply to try and first carefully think of what are appropriate proxies or indicators of this unobservable thing like ideology that I can pull out, and you can try to be smart about how you set up a sampling frame so that you meaningfully capture variation across that. But I mean, that's one of the sort of kinds of things that makes it really difficult when you design something, because you don't know how easily to, or you don't necessarily have the capacity to be representative because you don't really know how to observe it up front. And this is another one of the things you ought to consider when you look at what you found, like what variation have I actually captured? So it's a great point.
Can you look at like voting behavior in the past? Maybe voting for DeSantis or something like that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess I mean, you always could in theory, right? But again, going back to, people aren't jars. And so to what extent can people recall that? Are they willing to tell you that? Or can you access that as part of your design process? These are all kind of, there aren't easy answers to those, but they're all kind of fuzzy questions that'll help give you some sort of an imperfect but hopefully useful design when you come out of it.
Hi, thank you for your presentations, by the way. I also want to caveat this is not supposed to be a gotcha, aha question. I've never done agent-based modeling, so this is an honest, ignorant question. How do you incorporate things that are more remotely influential decision-making? I'm thinking particularly of the like visa requirements in the Gulf states that changed for migrants in Bangladesh who then started to relocate to, say, like Malaysia or the Balkans. So these are remote factors that are affecting decision-making at a household level. So how do you incorporate that? If you want to, Bangladesh is just, I'm familiar with, you don't have to use that geography.
I mean, I think there's probably two ways that you can approach that. The one is that if you're looking at the empirical, so what you're trying to do is use empirical data of the past to infer, people's behaviour in the future. And of course, there's many reasons why what we did yesterday won't be what we did tomorrow. But I think that you would be able to identify those changes in behaviour from past empirical data. But I'm not sure exactly how you would then integrate it into the decision-making module of the agent to kind of weight it. ABMs aren't particularly great at spatial scale, so that's why you will see that's why in the kind of framework you have a subsequent box for decision making, but certainly, I mean, you've kind of hit upon the challenge, and I think the understanding that's shared is that for all these environmental shocks and stresses and changes, if visa conditions were to change overnight, that would have a subsequently greater impact on those migration flows than arguably, you could make the case that actually that would be crucial. So, no, I'm not entirely sure how you would integrate those kind of changes unless you were able to see it in the historical record that those political decisions had made. And you can look at it more subtle changes. Sorry, just to say, there is a political envisaging of Bangladesh as an agrarian society. So obviously there's subtle and less subtle political pressures to kind of retain rural economies. So again, if that were to change, you would see that reflected. But I'm not quite sure how you would integrate that going forward.
Hi, my name is Sydney. I'm with Washington Sea Grant. Thank you for your presentations. And as a practitioner, I'm wondering if either the surveys or the models or data that you're familiar with could look at the effects of education and incentives on decision making. So whether that's education around flood risk, education about adaptation alternatives, or incentives, either technical assistance all the way to monetary assistance like buyouts or other factors that might influence decision making. Thank you.
Yeah, so I could answer that. At least for our research, for New York and Florida, we also looked at what if people would receive a premium on their buyouts and how much would they want to receive before they would migrate. And there we see that there are quite a substantial amount of people that say, okay, for no money, I'm going to leave. And we see that for the majority of them, if they would receive a certain premium on their house value, they would actually consider to migrate. So I've not delved into that data yet, but we plan to work with that later on as well. In that sense, you could incentivize people, but it will probably can be quite costly, I think.
If I might, just to add to the responses to both of the previous questions, which are sort of in the realm of like, could you do this? Could you add this thing in? And I think often, really, there's there's how good we are as programmers, and then there's how good we are as modeling thinkers. And they're two separate skill sets. And usually, I mean, if you're a good coder, you can do anything you want. The challenge is finding data to support things. And really an important question whenever we're asking, like, can we do this or not, is, does variation in that thing, is it important to answering the question that you've posed? And a model is always constructed to respond to a specific question, and it's rare to be able to repurpose a model in its, in its form to a different question. Often we want to say, well, if we have this new question, there are different things that belong in here or not. And the question of what belongs is always a response to, does that thing vary importantly with respect to my question? And with sort of then the next layer is often, well, we've identified that it matters, but we have this problem that, this incentive program has been around long enough that everybody's habituated to it. So we don't really know how it's experienced first as a new thing. And that's this really critical question around adaptation of like thinking about how does this thing that first is shocking and different then become this thing that we know about and respond to differently. And another sort of like area in the hazard space where that applies is when we think about floods, and there's lots of cool studies that look at what happens when people experience a flood, and you see this sort of immediate response of everything's scary, I do all these things and I forget about it. But that only describes some parts of the world. There are lots of parts of the world people experience shocks or floods all the time, and it's not, is there a shock? It's, has the pattern of floods shifted, or is the distribution of floods shifting? And that becomes an even more difficult thing to sort of identify differences in. And there's a nice field of like thinking about how to express and communicate compound climate hazards that kind of helps us bring them in, more effectively into social data collection instruments to do a better job of understanding what is the immediate experience of a change in the pattern of flooding. But those are the things that come in. It's not so much can we do it, but like, does it belong, and does variation help shape the outcome we care about? And then is there a way of capturing variation in how people respond? Sorry, that was long.
Oh yeah, I have something to add as well. There's also an emerging literature using like experiments, like choice experiments, where you can basically hypothesize a future that you find interesting and see how that has an effect. So in that sense, you could, for example, have these different risks like flooding, and then have like different policy packages like more education or higher insurance costs, and then see how under different scenarios that would influence adaptation or migration. And we see that there's an increasing literature in that. At least for adaptation, there's already quite a lot, and migration is just emerging in that sense.
So just a little bit of insight on Midas. I know that part of that variation you were just describing, Andrew, was around access to credit. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about what access to credit does in this sort of model and how flexible it is as a way of kind of understanding incentives.
Sure, and David is not a plant. I didn't set that up. But yeah, so one of the interesting, going back to this point, that in our analysis, we sort of found, well, that this thing that we found depends on a lot of things. And one of the important variables we explored, which we didn't have data to explore necessarily, we didn't know, we didn't have a great way of capturing how people might differ in their access to credit. So we kind of just turned it up and down as a knob to look to see, well, what happens? How much does variation in access to credit explain what people do differently? And the way, without getting into the weeds of how Midas is built, people kind of have social capital and investment in themselves, and we use that variation in that as a proxy for access to credit that people might have. We ramp that up and down. And we found that what's kind of interesting is, depending on who you are and what kinds of options you have available to you, you will choose different things. And so it's, you hear this term trapped populations a lot, and what we found was, what was maybe more helpful to unpack that more as moored populations, where there are different reasons to be remaining in place, either because you can't leave, or because you choose to remain in place. You choose to invest in place and change your conditions. And so that fits better, like that can explain, I choose, as we saw in Lars' model, like the flood improvements or like home improvement structural investments that at least let me sort of stay in place or feel like I'm better in place. So kind of teasing that out looks like an important thing to do. So having identified that effect, we then as modelers would say, we would do better to predict in the future if we could explain that a bit better, design a choice experiment or something like that helps us identify, what are how do people's preferences for different dimensions of flood responses vary, and how can we use that better to parcel out what people might do?
Yeah, I also have a question. So, especially directed to, I guess, Andrew and also Roland. You both, and especially Roland, actually also in this conceptual model, you described all these different drivers of migration that you need to account for in the modeling approach. And I'm wondering, especially looking at it from the coast move perspective, so from the model that we are trying to build, a global scale model that reflects all these different migration drivers and decisions that are being made. What would you say from coming from the more local / national kind of migration modeling and agent-based modeling, which factors should we include in the global model? Yeah, which factors do you think are the most crucial ones, and does it actually yeah, and how does it, I don't want to say, does it make sense to do this? Because I think it makes sense to do this. I think also what Roland just said about that a model is something to start a conversation. So I think there's definitely value in it. But what do you think, how much of a challenge is it actually to include these drivers of migration, and especially also thinking about the data limitations that we have and so on. So I would be really interested in your takes on this global scale approach, and how also maybe from your experience, how we can go about putting this model together.
I think this is an ongoing challenge that I'm guessing is common across people approaching this form of work. Is you want to account for as many, you want to start from an accurate understanding of the world and the complexities, and I think we're, and these conversations have been running along the last several days. We're talking about very complex systems, and there are multiple drivers, and it's very hard to categorize the influence of each. And at the same time, when you look at, and just this is descriptive statistical analysis of survey data, for example, for those households that in the survey where they have an intention to migrate, when the question is, well, what's preventing you from migrating at this moment? I think there were 20 different identified options, and yet the one that spiked was lack of resources, and it was incredible spike. So I think I'm sort of ducking the question in a sense, because I think within ourselves we aggregate those, as an agent. We aggregate these influences. And I don't know, I mean, Andrew may have an opinion whether this is, we aggregate it simply in the answer to the survey, that we draw it together. But actually, and again, I'm starting to see that because sea level rise impacts are sea level rise shocks and stresses, those analogous with sea level rise, I keep on correcting myself, across the different coastline, it's very hard to find a signal relationship between migration intention and a specific shock or stressor. But if you simply say, aggregate, has there been an economic impact due to any environmental shocks and stresses, you begin to see a very strong relationship. So I'm sort of ducking the question by saying, in a sense, we want to be as descriptive and as complex as the real world, but actually the aggregation happens not necessarily in the modeler's model, but actually in the agent and the individual. So I think once you understand, so this perhaps relates to the earlier question, it's like what are the primary drivers, and can we isolate those and then understand how those work? So yeah, I think that sensitivity testing is more important than me saying, well, actually, I think you need to look at this, that, and the other. I think partly because, especially, and this is a more minor point, but when you're looking at, potentially when you're looking at global south, global north, the livelihood impact, rather than the impact on habitability, loss of homes, is very different in those two locations. So I think that's just one thing to be aware of when you're comparing and contrasting. So I hope I answered it, even by sidestepping, if you see what I mean.
I don't know if you want to hear any more. I think it covers a lot of ground. I would just say, different things matter at different scales, right? I think we all kind of know this, and there's that adage that everything's related, but things that are closer together are more related. So at the global scale, the question is like, what matters and what's kind of noise at this scale? And it also goes back to what's your question, what do you want to get? It could be the case that there are interesting things that matter within a region that end up spilling out and reshaping something that happens globally. But your challenge as modelers is going to be, how do I capture those on common footing with other things that could matter in other regions? And the thing that you want to avoid as a modeler is modeling in a way that you kind of bake in some artifact where the effect that you see is really just like a seam effect, where I've treated something one way in one place and a different way in another place, and because I put them together in the same model, it created an imbalance that doesn't really explain anything. And that's the thing you want to avoid. So I would say, like, it's worth thinking about at that global scale, what are the things that matter? What are the flows that seem to matter? And what about it is it that we want to explain? And the other thing too, and you can kind of get lost in this as a modeler, like, we're not trying to explain everything. Like, we're not trying to simulate reality. I had this advisor when I was in grad school named Rick Riolo, and he had this nice use of the words model versus simulation, where he sort of said a model is the simplest possible thing you can put together to understand the processes you care about. A simulation is the richest possible experience you can create to sort of feel like you're really there. Like you sit down with a flight simulator and your 7 screens and your fancy chair, and you feel like you're flying a plane, but you understand nothing about what's happening behind it. It's very different than the simple 3 sets of equations or whatever that we apply and can understand what the effect of one thing is on the other. Now, I belabor this point just to say, in a global model of migration, the likelihood is your explained variation is probably going to be really low, but it's going to tell you something possibly interesting and helpful. And so just reminding ourselves the goal isn't realism necessarily, it's explaining an important effect. And so maybe that's helpful guidance, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And to be honest, it was a really great session, great presentation. Thank you for that. And I totally want to echo what has been said until now. Maybe a little bit back, why are we doing these kind of things? And one of the reasons is that until recently, a lot of climate change impact studies were really top-down, right? You started with the climate scenarios, and then you go like, how is the physical system changed because of climate change? And then you model the impacts, right? And then these impacts were given to the policymakers like Sydney and others, and then they have to deal with it. Okay, what can I do about these impacts? Not accounting and not addressing for the fact that if you implement the policy, this also have a reverse effect on the natural system. And this is exactly what we are doing with these agent-based models. We not only look at how the physical system is altered by the climate change, but also how then policies and we human beings are also changing the physical system. And to understand these complex relationships, this is one of the reasons for having these kind of modeling approaches. Notwithstanding, Andrew and others, what you are saying, the limitations. Yes, of course. I mean, there are so many limitations because we also add complexity by doing that. But what we can do is understand these relationships, so better, let's say, learning about these. And of course, also, your question, Sydney, is also see, okay, how do policies, for example, how can they play out? I learn from that. Not saying that this is always 100% realistic, but understanding how policy and human interventions interact, let's say, with the socioeconomic system. So that's my perception on it, and I think this is emerging. I mean, I completely agree that there are many uncertainties. What I also do see, and that's quite interesting, is the enormous increase in data. It's going very fast, also at the larger scales. And I think what we will see as modelers actually that we will be maybe outnumbered by the data people and the machine learning type of people who use data actually to do predictions in the future. But for now, yeah, this is what we have. But thank you very much for all your comments, and it's really insightful.
Thanks, Jeroen. I think we are almost nearing the end of the session. So if there are any maybe reactions to this from your side, so from the speaker side, or one quick final question, I think this we could accommodate. Okay, then I guess there's plenty of time now during the lunch break to continue the discussions. I guess that especially, of course, the speakers who are here in person, that they might be willing to answer some questions also over the lunch break. Thanks very much for your participation, and yeah, thanks for the meeting.